A flamethrower is a legal product in South Africa. A local inventor designed it to be bolted underneath a car, triggered from the driver's seat because carjacking had become so routine in Johannesburg that conventional security measures simply stopped working. That single invention tells you more about institutional failure than any crime statistic ever could. This episode covers 13 territories where the basic logic of safety has collapsed entirely, and the reasons behind each collapse are not random. They follow a pattern. Mexican cartels do not hide their armored vehicles. They drive them on public roads in broad daylight, columns of hand-welded steel trucks with improvised turrets and armed fighters, because concealment would imply they fear the state. They do not. The Sinaloa model represents something beyond organized crime. It is a parallel government with its own military hardware, its own taxation systems, and its own courts. In Lagos, the kidnapping of foreign executives has been refined into a structured industry, with ransom rates indexed to the victim's nationality and corporate rank. In Mogadishu, the absence of any functioning central authority for decades produced open ocean piracy as an economic adaptation, not a moral failure, but a rational response to a world where no other economy existed. The cobalt and coltan pulled from Congolese mines powers the devices in your pocket. The supply chain has been audited, reported, and condemned repeatedly. The conditions have not meaningfully changed. Libya hosts active slave markets. Aleppo is concrete rubble. Each of these 13 locations has an internal logic, a sequence of decisions, abandonments, and power vacuums that explains precisely why this happened here and not somewhere else. By the time we reach number 1, the word collapse will mean something different to you than it does right now. A member state of the OECD, an organization that exists to represent the world's most developed economies, had armored fighting vehicles rolling down its public highways. None of them appeared in any military registry. None belonged to any army. They were built in hidden workshops by cartel mechanics who welded steel plates onto truck frames, cut firing slits into the walls, and mounted machine gun turrets on top. That is not a metaphor. That is number 13 on our list. The vehicles appeared in the Mexican states of Sinaloa and Tamaulipas, strongholds of the Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas, respectively. Mexican security forces began documenting seizures of these machines around 2010, and what they found inside followed a consistent pattern. Multi-layered steel armor, shooter embrasures, ventilation systems, and in some cases, basic sound insulation. Certain vehicles were designed to carry up to 20 armed fighters at once. Local residents called them narco-tanks. The Mexican military used the term improvised armored combat vehicles in official reports. The difference in language did not change what the machines were capable of. The reason these vehicles matter goes beyond the immediate threat they posed. Municipal police forces across both states were simply outgunned. The armor these machines carried exceeded anything available to local law enforcement. Even regular army units reported serious operational difficulties when encountering them. The cartels had made a deliberate choice to stop concealing themselves and to fight in the open, on paved roads, in daylight, with hardware that announced their presence rather than hiding it. That shift in behavior is the actual story here. An organization that builds armored vehicles and drives them on federal highways is not challenging state authority. It is performing state authority, projecting force, controlling territory, and demonstrating to every person who sees that vehicle that the government's monopoly on violence no longer applies in this place. The steel is just the most visible part of what had already happened to governance in those regions. The narco-tank is a symbol, but it is a symbol made of metal, and it drove in public. The question that follows naturally is this: what happens in places where citizens cannot rely on the state at all, and so begin building their own weapons to defend themselves? That is where our list goes next. In 1998, a South African inventor legally sold a flamethrower designed to be bolted underneath a car. Not a prototype, not a military contract, a consumer product available to any Johannesburg resident willing to pay for it. That fact alone tells you more about the city at that moment than almost any crime report could. This is number 12 on our list. The device was called the blaster, and it worked exactly as the name suggests. Mounted beneath the chassis, it discharged jets of liquefied gas from both sides of the vehicle whenever the driver triggered it during an attack. Charlie Rector, the inventor, said he built it after learning that a woman he knew had been violently carjacked. He patented it, marketed it, and found several hundred buyers. South African law at the time contained nothing that made it illegal. Police were uncomfortable with the concept, but had no legal mechanism to ban it. To understand why hundreds of people thought a car-mounted flamethrower was a reasonable purchase, you have to understand what Johannesburg had become. Carjacking, armed robbery of a vehicle with the driver still inside, had scaled into something resembling an industry. South African police statistics recorded more than 15,000 such crimes nationally in peak years, with Johannesburg and its surrounding townships accounting for a disproportionate share. Attackers chose their locations with cold precision. Traffic lights, shopping centre exits, the gates of residential estates, anywhere a driver had to slow down. The assault itself could be over in under 10 seconds. The city's response to this reality was, in its own way, just as remarkable as Rector's invention. Authorities erected official road signs designating specific intersections as high-risk carjacking zones. These were not warnings improvised by neighbourhood associations. They were government signs, formal acknowledgement that the state could not guarantee safety at those coordinates and had chosen to map the danger rather than eliminate it. That combination, official signs of state helplessness and a consumer market for personal flamethrowers, produced a particular kind of urban landscape. Fear became structural. It shaped road behaviour, architecture, and product design simultaneously. Johannesburg in this era is a case study in what happens when systemic insecurity runs long enough and deep enough to rewire an entire city's logic. But Johannesburg still had a state, however strained. The next entry on our list takes us somewhere that luxury disappeared long ago, a place where the government is theatre and the men with guns and motorcycles write the actual rules. In Lagos, kidnapping has a price list. Not a rough estimate, a structured tariff negotiated through intermediaries, settled like a corporate transaction. This is number 11 on our ranking, and it represents something rare in the global landscape of organised crime, a kidnapping industry that operates with the consistency of a service sector. Lagos is the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa, home to more than 20 million people, and the financial and oil hub of Nigeria. It is also the continent's most economically efficient market for human abduction. The targets are not chosen at random. Foreign executives from oil multinationals, drilling engineers from offshore platforms, senior representatives of international logistics firms. These are the profiles that define the victim pool. The selection process begins weeks before any abduction takes place. Operatives conduct surveillance on corporate vehicles, map the daily routes of potential targets, and recruit informants embedded inside hotel staff and private security details. The intelligence gathering phase mirrors the due diligence of any serious business operation. When the moment comes, the execution reflects that preparation. Ransom demands, according to private security firms and investigative journalists who have tracked these cases, range from $200,000 to $600,000 per individual. There is an opening figure, a period of negotiation, a final agreed sum, and a structured handover. Lawyers and local business associates of the victim frequently serve as go-betweens. Victims are kept alive because a living hostage retains value. Harm reduces the price. The physical landscape of Lagos makes this industry possible. The glass towers of Victoria Island stand a short distance from dense informal settlements where a person can vanish without trace. Multinational companies operating in the city have responded by building parallel security ecosystems, armoured convoys, armed escorts, emergency evacuation protocols. The existence of that infrastructure is itself a data point. Nigerian authorities maintain an official posture of active prosecution, but investigations routinely stall, convictions remain scarce, and the abductions continue at a pace that undermines any claim of systemic deterrence. A city doesn't have to be at war to become one of the most dangerous places on earth. Caracas proved that. By the mid-2000s, Venezuela's capital had descended into a kind of organized lawlessness that defied easy categorization. Not a conflict zone, not a functioning state, but something in between, held together by armed motorcycle groups known as Colectivos, who patrol the streets with near-total impunity. These are not rogue gangs operating in spite of the government. That is precisely what makes them so dangerous. The Colectivos trace their origins to the Bolivarian circles established under Hugo Chavez in the early 2000s. Neighborhood-level political structures designed to build grassroots support for his government. Over time, segments of those networks acquired weapons, received quiet backing from state institutions, and evolved into a parallel enforcement apparatus. When Chavez died in 2013 and Nicolas Maduro took power, the Colectivos became more autonomous and more brutal. Maduro needed them. In the poorest neighborhoods, the barrios, the state had effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful institutional form, and the Colectivos filled that vacuum on the government's behalf. The economic collapse gave that territorial control an almost absolute weight. In 2018, the IMF estimated Venezuela's annual inflation at over 1 million%. The bolivar became worthless. A doctor's monthly salary couldn't buy a kilogram of flour. Pensions were symbolic. In that environment, controlling access to food, fuel, and informal markets wasn't just profitable, it was the only real currency of power left. The Colectivos embedded themselves in exactly that role, taxing street vendors, regulating scarce goods, and sustaining their authority through economic dependency as much as through fear. Their violence has been extensively documented. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International recorded multiple incidents in which Colectivos opened fire on protesters during the 2017 and 2019 waves of demonstrations that swept Caracas. They operated in apparent coordination with state security forces while remaining formally outside any official structure. That legal ambiguity is not accidental. It is a feature, not a flaw. By keeping the Colectivos officially unrecognized, the government ensures they can act with impunity, while the state retains plausible deniability. Journalists who tried to document their activities were attacked, had equipment seized, or were beaten in broad daylight. Foreign correspondents were not spared. For residents of the barrios, the Colectivos are an invisible ceiling pressing down on daily life. You don't speak openly against the government. You don't photograph the wrong thing. You don't attend the wrong rally. The consequences of breaking these unwritten rules are never officially recorded and almost never investigated. Caracas represents a specific and replicable model of urban control, a state that has not disappeared but has outsourced its violence to structures accountable to no one but themselves, operating in a legal void the government actively maintains. From Venezuela's capital, we move south to Brazil, where the hillside favelas above Rio de Janeiro are governed not by political allies of the state, but by drug cartels so entrenched that police enter only in armoured vehicles, weapons drawn. 9. That is where Rio de Janeiro lands on this list, and the number itself is almost absurd when you consider what it means. A city of beaches, carnival, and one of the most photographed bays on Earth, also contains entire neighborhoods where Brazilian law does not apply, where armed teenagers stand guard at street corners and where the police only enter inside armored vehicles. This is not a description of a war zone in the conventional sense. It is a description of a major city hosting two parallel systems of government separated by a few hundred meters of hillside. The organization responsible for this reality is the Facção Vermelha, the Red Faction, founded in 1979 inside Cândido Mendes prison. Its origins were almost mundane by the standards of what it became, a self-protection alliance among inmates. Over the following decades, it expanded outward from those prison walls and constructed what analysts now describe as one of the most organized criminal structures in Latin America, with control over a significant portion of the city's more than 1,000 favelas. What distinguishes the Facção Vermelha is not simply its capacity for violence, but the administrative apparatus it has built around that violence. It collects taxes from local merchants. It adjudicates disputes between residents. It sets curfews on streets that officially belong to a Brazilian municipality. Rights organizations and journalists have documented the routine presence of armed minors, some younger than 15, serving as sentries at the entrances to controlled areas. Police operations in these neighborhoods bear little resemblance to law enforcement as it is understood elsewhere. Officers enter in armored vehicles known as caveirão, meaning big skull, and the tactical logic of those incursions is closer to military assault than to policing. Civilian casualties during such operations have triggered multiple investigations by international human rights bodies. Brazil attempted a structural solution in 2008 with the Pacifying Police Units program, designed to establish a permanent state presence in reclaimed favelas. For a period, it worked. By the middle of the following decade, most of those gains had been reversed. The deeper story here is about how parallel power forms from below, built out of prison solidarity and concentrated poverty, until it becomes indistinguishable from governance. The next entry on this list tells the opposite story. Armed structures that were assembled from above by the state itself and then grew beyond any control the state retained. El Salvador is now one of the safest countries in Latin America. That sentence would have been unthinkable a decade ago. For years, the country held the grim distinction of recording over 100 murders per 100,000 residents in a single year, a rate that outpaced the death tolls of active war zones. MS-13 and Barrio 18 didn't just operate in the shadows. They ran entire neighborhoods like parallel governments, taxing bus drivers, market vendors, school children, and small business owners. Refusing to pay wasn't a negotiation, it was a death sentence. The actual government watched, largely powerless, as this shadow economy of violence entrenched itself across the country. Then, in March 2022, President Nayib Bukele declared a state of emergency. What followed was a crackdown of staggering scale. Tens of thousands of arrests in a matter of months. The prison system buckled under the weight. The answer was CECOT, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, a mega-prison unlike anything else in the Western Hemisphere. Built at extraordinary speed and opened in early 2023, it holds up to 40,000 inmates. No windows, no outside contact. Dozens of people per cell, under continuous surveillance around the clock. The government released footage of hundreds of men in white shorts, seated on bare floors, hands locked behind their heads, images that circulated globally within hours. Human rights organizations have since documented deaths in custody, alleged torture, and arrests made without sufficient evidence. Bukele's counter is blunt. Homicide rates have dropped by more than 90%. People who hadn't walked outside after dark in years say they now feel safe. CECOT sits at the center of a brutal equation. A state that was consumed by criminal violence has reasserted control, but through methods that raise fundamental questions about what that control actually means. Whether it holds, and at what cost, remains unresolved. A country can have a government and no state at the same time. Libya, after 2011, proved exactly that. When the Western coalition helped rebels dismantle Muammar Gaddafi's regime, the internationally recognized government that followed could hold meetings, issue statements, and receive foreign delegations. But it could not collect taxes, enforce laws, or control a single road into Tripoli's airport. That authority belonged to militias, dozens of them. Each one holding a neighborhood, a checkpoint, a piece of infrastructure, and charging whatever it pleased to whoever passed through. This is number 7 on our list: Libya's slave markets and militia-controlled Tripoli. The collapse was not slow. Gaddafi had held the country together through personal terror, tribal bargains, and oil money distributed as loyalty payments. Remove him, and the architecture of the state vanished almost immediately, not over years, but within months of his death in 2011. What filled the space was fragmentation, competing governments, hundreds of armed factions, and the complete disappearance of what political scientists call the state's monopoly on violence. Into that vacuum flowed the most profitable business available: human trafficking. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa attempting to cross the Mediterranean toward Europe were intercepted in Libyan waters or on land, handed over to armed groups, and sold. In 2017, CNN journalists documented open-air auctions taking place near Tripoli. The price for a human being, according to reporters who attended these auctions, was approximately $100. This was not metaphor, it was recorded on video. The militias running migrant detention centers collected revenue from multiple directions simultaneously, from smugglers paying for access, from families paying ransom, from buyers at auction. And the government that was supposed to stop this depended on those same militias to maintain any semblance of order in the capital. The system fed itself. Visually, this Libya looks like concrete blast barriers across wide boulevards, abandoned ministry buildings with shattered windows, pickup trucks mounted with anti-aircraft guns, and camps where thousands of people wait for an outcome no one can name. Institutions gone, violence as the only functioning currency. What makes Libya's collapse particularly striking is its speed, visible, documented, and witnessed by the entire international community in real time. The next entry on our list is a different kind of collapse, one stretched across a decade of war in which every faction fought every other, and civilians found themselves trapped between front lines with no possibility of neutrality. That city is Aleppo. A city can survive invasion, it can survive occupation. What it cannot survive, as Aleppo proved, is being fought over simultaneously by forces that have no reason to stop. That is the paradox at the heart of position 6 on this list. Aleppo was not destroyed by one war, but by several wars occupying the same streets at the same time. Before 2012, Aleppo was Syria's largest city and its economic engine. Nearly 2 million people lived there. Textile factories operated alongside ancient soap workshops that had been producing laurel oil soap for centuries. The city sat on historic Silk Road trade routes and carried more than 8,000 years of continuous human settlement. It was, by any measure, irreplaceable. What unraveled it was the collapse of the state's monopoly on violence. From 2012 onward, the city fractured between Assad's government forces, backed by Russian airstrikes and Iranian proxy militias, and dozens of armed opposition groups, ranging from moderate factions to jihadist organizations, including ISIS. No single actor held the whole city. That absence of unified control is precisely what made Aleppo so lethal. The front line ran through apartment buildings, through hospitals, through market squares. Physicians for Human Rights documented systematic air attacks on medical facilities. International monitors and journalists recorded the use of barrel bombs, improvised explosive devices dropped from helicopters onto residential neighborhoods, a tactic with no plausible military precision and an obvious civilian cost. By the time government forces retook eastern Aleppo in late 2016, after months of siege, satellite imagery showed entire districts erased to their foundations. The United Nations estimated that more than 300,000 people had died across Syria by that point, and over half the country's population had been forced from their homes. What Aleppo illustrated with brutal clarity is that a multi-party conflict involving foreign powers produces a specific and catastrophic outcome: the elimination of neutral ground. There was no functioning court, no protective institution, no safe corridor that held. Every structure that normally absorbs the violence of war had been destroyed or co-opted. Aleppo ranks sixth here because it is the clearest modern case of what happens when state authority dissolves and multiple armed actors, each with foreign backers, compete for the same urban space. The next entry on this list takes us somewhere the dynamic shifts entirely. A state that did not lose control, but chose to use that control as a weapon against its own people. United Nations peacekeepers stood and watched. For days, in July 2016, government soldiers gang-raped women within earshot of a UN protection base in Juba. The Blue Helmets did not intervene. That detail alone tells you almost everything you need to know about South Sudan. Number 5 on our list. A country where impunity is not the exception, but the operating principle, and where hunger has been turned into a weapon of state policy. South Sudan became independent in 2011, the youngest nation on earth, born from decades of war against Khartoum. The international community celebrated. Within 2 years, the country collapsed into a civil war that proved more savage than anything that had come before. President Salva Kiir and his former deputy Riek Machar took a political power struggle and reframed it as ethnic conflict, Dinka against Nuer. And in doing so, they industrialized suffering. Famine stopped being a consequence of war. It became a strategy. UN investigators documented what happened with clinical precision. Government forces systematically burning crops, seizing livestock, blocking humanitarian convoys, and doing so specifically in areas populated by communities perceived as opposition supporters. The Commission did not describe this as negligence or collateral damage. They called it the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war, a war crime under international law. In 2017, the UN formally declared famine in Unity State. Approximately 6 million people were pushed to the edge of catastrophe. Back in Juba, armed groups moved freely through the city. Journalists attempting to film atrocities were beaten and robbed by men in uniform. The sexual violence documented near the UN compound in July 2016 appears in the organization's own official report, not as an allegation, but as a finding. A state that cannot or will not protect civilians within a few hundred meters of international observers has already answered the question of what it thinks human life is worth. South Sudan uses famine as a verdict against its own people. Where this country kills through blockade and calculated neglect, the next city on our list was destroyed the loud way, with bombs, artillery, and a decade of total war in which no side remained untouched. $100. That is the documented market price for a human life in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, at its worst. Not a rumor, not a figure pulled from speculation. Journalists and human rights organizations recorded it as an established rate within the city's contract killing industry, known locally as sicariato. Number 4 on our list is not a war zone in any formal sense. It is an industrial city, a place with functioning factories, open markets, and busy streets. And yet, by 2012, international organizations tracking urban violence had confirmed what residents already knew. San Pedro Sula was the most dangerous city on the planet among those not officially at war. The homicide rate that year exceeded 170 killings per 100,000 inhabitants annually. To put that in perspective, that figure made walking certain streets statistically more lethal than being present in several active armed conflict zones recorded during the same period. The city sits in the Ulua Valley in northern Honduras, the country's industrial backbone. It had infrastructure, commerce, economic activity. What it lacked was any meaningful state authority capable of operating independently from the criminal networks that had systematically captured or paralyzed its institutions. Those networks were primarily structured around affiliates of Mexican cartels and two local gangs, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, that had divided the city into invisible but rigidly enforced territorial zones. Every intersection, every bus stop, every wall carried markings that outsiders could not decode, but that every resident understood as binding law. Businesses paid a war tax to gangs simply for permission to open. Entire neighborhoods were inaccessible to police, except in coordinated armed groups. The sicariato was not a fringe phenomenon. It was a functioning industry with documented supply, demand, and pricing. And the corruption went further than passive negligence. Investigations established that a portion of police officers themselves served as intermediaries in arranging contract killings. The institution designed to protect citizens had become a component of the same violence it was supposed to suppress. When the enforcer and the criminal operate within the same structure, the concept of public safety ceases to have meaning. San Pedro Sula shows what happens when state capture moves beyond corruption into something more complete, when the machinery of order is fully repurposed by those it was built to restrain. From this industrialized market of killing, our list moves to a place where violence takes an older and equally systematic form. A place where human beings are sold openly. Every time someone buys a new phone, there is a statistical likelihood that a component inside it was made possible by forced labor and systematic rape. That is not a metaphor. That is the documented reality of the coltan mines in eastern Congo, rated number 3 on our global index of conflict-driven exploitation. Coltan, the shorthand for columbite tantalite, is the mineral that enables capacitors in virtually every modern electronic device. No coltan, no smartphones, no laptops, no gaming consoles. And between 60 and 80% of the world's supply comes from the provinces of North and South Kivu, in a region where armed groups have turned mineral extraction into a machinery of terror. The FDLR, M23, and various Mai Mai factions control the mines at gunpoint. UN investigators and human rights organizations have documented forced labor on a massive scale. Men and boys driven into the pits under threat of violence. But the group's most calculated weapon is not the rifle. It is sexual violence, deployed not as a byproduct of conflict, but as a deliberate instrument of population control. Dr. Denis Mukwege, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate who runs Panzi Hospital in Bukavu, has documented tens of thousands of cases. The scale led the United Nations to describe Eastern Congo as the world's capital of conflict-related sexual violence. The mineral's journey from the red clay of these jungle pits to a consumer's pocket spans multiple borders and layers of deliberate opacity. Local brokers pass it to intermediaries in Rwanda, who channel it toward Asian processing facilities, which supply assembly lines for brands whose logos are universally recognized. The Congolese state functions here in name only. Its own army has faced repeated, documented accusations of committing the same crimes as the militias it nominally fights. International sanctions exist. Mineral certification schemes exist. Neither has broken the chain, because the chain is too long. And the economic incentive to ignore its origins is too powerful. The violence here is not incidental to the global electronics economy. It is embedded in it. More than 21 million people needed humanitarian aid at the peak of this crisis, and almost none of them were soldiers. That is the central fact about Yemen, the number 2 entry on this list, and it demands an explanation that goes beyond the word war. Yemen did not simply descend into conflict. It underwent total state collapse, a condition in which no authority, not the Saudi-backed government in exile, not the Houthi movement controlling the north, not the southern separatists holding Aden, has either the capacity or the intention to protect civilians. What remains is a fractured territory where millions of people exist without documentation, without money, and without any realistic path to safety. The Saudi-led coalition began its air campaign in 2015. What followed was documented methodically by human rights organizations and United Nations investigators. Strikes on markets, hospitals, wedding processions, and funerals. Sana'a, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, its historic center, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, absorbed systematic bombardment. The visual evidence is unmistakable. The distinctive blast patterns of aerial ordnance pressed into the walls of residential neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. But bombs were not the primary killer. The coalition's naval and air blockade tightened at critical moments, severed supply lines to a country that was already importing roughly 90% of its basic goods. Food and medicines stopped moving. The result was a manufactured famine, not a natural disaster, but a policy outcome. Children did not die in explosions. They died of starvation and cholera in hospitals without electricity, without clean water, without drugs on the shelves. The cholera outbreak that began in 2016 became one of the largest in recorded modern history, more than 2 million confirmed cases. A disease associated with the 19th century spreading through a 21st century catastrophe built from deliberate choices. Yemen sits at number 2. It ranks below only a country where state absence has not lasted a decade, but has consumed several consecutive generations. A country can disappear and the world will simply root around it. That is not a metaphor. That is Somalia. Since 1991, when the regime of Siad Barre collapsed, Somalia has had no central government capable of controlling its own territory. Not a weakened government, not a corrupt one, no government at all in any meaningful sense. Mogadishu, ranked number 1 on our list, became the arena where that absence played out most visibly. Streets divided between armed clan factions, colonial-era buildings riddled with bullet holes, and burned-out armoured vehicles left on roadsides not as monuments but as ordinary urban furniture, too embedded in the landscape to bother removing. In 1993, the United States decided this was a problem it could fix. The Battle of Mogadishu proved otherwise. 18 American soldiers died. Images of their bodies being dragged through the streets circulated globally. The lesson was unambiguous. Even a superpower cannot impose order in a place where the very concept of order has lost its referent. What followed were decades of UN missions, African Union peacekeeping contingents, and international conferences, all of them colliding with the same fundamental reality. Power in Somalia belonged to whoever had more weapons and stronger clan ties, and no external framework could override that logic. The consequences extended far beyond the capital. Somalia's coastline stretches nearly 4,000 kilometers. With no state to police it, that coastline became the operational base for one of the most disruptive criminal enterprises of the early 21st century. Between 2008 and 2011, Somali pirates seized hundreds of commercial vessels in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden, holding crews for months and extracting ransoms worth millions of dollars per ship. This was not opportunistic theft. It was an industry complete with investors, negotiators, and internal hierarchies built entirely on statelessness. Mogadishu today is a skyline of minarets beside military antennas, of open-air markets beside the ruins of government quarters. It is the extreme case, the baseline from which all other state failure is measured. The world's most dangerous cities have something in common, and it's not poverty. It's the absence of a state with the will or the capacity to enforce a monopoly on violence. 13 locations, 13 case studies in what happens when that monopoly collapses or never existed in the first place. Sinaloa's roads are patrolled by cartel armored trucks, not police convoys. In Johannesburg, private security vehicles are fitted with flamethrowers, legally, routinely, without public outcry. Lagos has developed a structured kidnapping economy, fixed rates, professional intermediaries, negotiation protocols. These are not signs of chaos, they are signs of alternative order. In Caracas, motorcycle collectives called Colectivos control movement through entire neighborhoods. In Rio's favelas, armed teenagers enforce the borders of a state within a state that predates and often outlasts any government intervention. El Salvador responded to gang rule by building a mega prison holding tens of thousands, the state's last available argument. Tripoli hosts slave markets in the 21st century. Aleppo was destroyed in front of the world's cameras. In South Sudan, starvation is deployed as a military strategy. A contract killing in San Pedro Sula costs $100. Congo's mines supply the cobalt and coltan inside every smartphone on Earth, extracted under conditions of documented forced labor and militia violence. Yemen has functioned without reliable medical infrastructure or consistent food supply for years, under airstrikes that show no preference for civilian sites. And Mogadishu has survived longer without a functioning state than almost any city in modern history. The causes are consistent across all 13. Corruption left unaddressed, wars made profitable for too many parties, and indifference sustained long enough to become policy. The world knows. The world keeps buying. If this made you think, like and subscribe. The next episode is already waiting.